That morning, a powerful billionaire collapsed in the middle of a park, just minutes away from death. No bodyguards, no assistants, only two 5-year-old twin girls on their way to visit their comatose mother happened to stop. No one could have imagined that this simple moment would change the lives of all three of them forever. For most people, it was just an ordinary morning. But for Nathan Cole, CEO of a major construction corporation and one of the most influential businessmen in America, it was different. After months of living by an entirely closed-off schedule, this morning, for the first time, he gave his driver the day off and decided to walk to the office. No limousine, no tinted glass, no security cordon, just him and the city. He told himself he needed some fresh air before the tense upcoming board meeting. But deep down, perhaps he was tired of those cold glass walls, tired of watching life through layers of soundproof barriers, where the noise and randomness of the outside world never truly reached him. Nathan walked at a measured pace, his perfectly tailored navy suit hugging his frame, polished leather shoes catching the morning sunlight. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, and behind his sunglasses, his blue eyes held a distant coolness. He took in the sight of joggers passing by, elderly couples chatting on benches, a group of children pedaling past on bicycles, a world that felt strangely foreign, one he hadn't truly touched in a long time. That morning, the park was serene, but inside Nathan's chest, something unfamiliar began to creep in at first. Just a vague pressure, then a shortening of breath. He was used to ignoring bodily discomfort. In the business world, resilience sometimes meant dismissing pain. A little shortness of breath was nothing compared to the hundreds of millions in deals awaiting him. Until, halfway through the walk, the world before him blurred as though a pane of glass had been fogged over. A sudden wave of dizziness hit, and the ground seemed to tilt sharply to one side. Nathan staggered, one hand gripping the metal railing along the path, but his heartbeat had already grown chaotic. A stabbing pain, sharp as a knife, tore through his left chest, radiating quickly into his shoulder and arm. He tried to draw a deep breath, tried to take another step, but his legs betrayed him. They buckled, useless, and before he could think of anything else, the ground rushed up to meet him. Then everything went black. He hit the path with a heavy thud. No one stopped right away. A young couple passed by mid-conversation, seemingly unaware. A teenage boy whizzed past on his bike, earbuds in tight. Only the morning sun remained, silently spilling light over the still figure of the man whose skin had turned ashen, whose breath was as thin as a thread. And then, two small figures appeared. Sophie and Ella, 5-year-old twin sisters, were skipping along the familiar route to the hospital. Their golden curls bounced, blue eyes bright, white dresses fluttering with each step, like little fairies out of a storybook. But the story this morning held no sparkling magic. Their mother, Rachel, had been in a coma for over a month after an accident. Every few days, their grandmother would take them to the hospital. Today, too tired to go herself, she let them walk ahead a stretch of road they knew by heart. Down to each paving stone, Sophie saw Nathan first. She froze, tugged her sister's hand, and pointed toward the motionless man. "He's not moving," she whispered, her tiny voice laced with worry. The two girls edged closer. The man didn't look scary, just still, eyes closed, his face drained of color. Ella crouched down, leaned close, then looked up to ask softly, "Sophie, is he breathing?" A moment of silence. Then Ella reached into her tiny pink backpack and pulled out a pink phone, the one their grandmother had given them to call for help in emergencies. She pressed the big green button labeled "Help" and held it to her ear. When the 911 operator answered, Ella's voice came through clear, bright, and surprisingly calm. "A man just fell down in the park, near the fountain. He's not waking up. My name's Ella, and this is my sister Sophie. We're on our way to visit our mom in the hospital." Each answer came crisp and unshaken. The dispatcher confirmed that an ambulance was on its way. While they waited, Ella held her sister's hand tight, and the two of them stood beside Nathan like tiny sentinels, eyes fixed on the faint rise and fall of his chest. It wasn't long before the wail of sirens tore through the quiet. Two paramedics rushed over. One knelt to check his pulse and breathing, while the other began chest compressions and rescue breaths. A quick question followed. "Are you the ones who called?" Ella nodded. The medic gave a small smile. "You just saved his life." No reply. No smile. The girls simply stepped back, eyes following as Nathan was lifted onto the stretcher and wheeled toward the ambulance. Then, hand in hand, they continued down the path toward the hospital, as if saving a man's life was just another small part of their morning routine. The first sound Nathan Cole heard when consciousness returned was the steady beep, beep of a heart monitor. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled his lungs, bringing with it a feeling both foreign and unpleasant. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, opening only slowly to meet the stark white light pouring from the ceiling above. It took several seconds for things to come into focus: white walls, beige curtains drawn part way, an IV bag hanging silently beside the bed. His chest still ached with a dull throb, and his throat felt parched, as though he had swallowed sand. A gentle female voice broke through the haze. "You're awake. That's good." A nurse approached, placing a warm hand on his arm. Her expression held both relief and seriousness. "You gave us quite a scare." Nathan tried to speak, but only a few hoarse words escaped. "What happened to me?" "You collapsed in the park from a heart rhythm disturbance. It could be stress or an underlying condition. But you were very lucky someone called for help almost immediately. If they'd been even 5 minutes later, it might have been a very different outcome." Nathan frowned slightly. Fragments of memory surfaced, sunlight filtering through leaves, the wave of dizziness, and then darkness. He drew in a slow breath and asked quietly, "Who called?" The nurse smiled faintly, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Two little girls, about 5 years old. They saw you fall, used the phone their grandmother had given them to call 911, and stayed by your side until the ambulance arrived. Then they just left quietly." Nathan blinked in surprise. "Two girls, 5 years old. Yes, as far as we know. Their mother is in a coma, so their grandmother often takes them to the hospital. That day, she let them walk ahead, after calling, and once they saw you being safely loaded into the ambulance, they continued on to visit their mother without accepting any praise or thanks." Her words left Nathan momentarily speechless. In his world, everything was planned, calculated in numbers and strategies, and yet his life had just been saved by two children. Children for whom the act was nothing extraordinary. The next morning, when the doctor informed him his heart was stable, Nathan didn't ask about meeting schedules or project updates. Instead, he turned to his assistant, who had just arrived with flowers and documents, and said, "Find those two little girls. I need to meet them." The assistant hesitated. "You want to meet them right away?" "Sir." Nathan's gaze was unwavering. "As soon as possible." That afternoon, a young doctor brought him the emergency team's report. A brief note. Sophie Bennett and Ella Bennett. Contact number for grandmother, just a few lines. But to Nathan, it was enough. Against advice to use a wheelchair, he insisted on walking. Each slow step down the hallway made his heart pound. But there was an invisible pull urging him forward, to see those girls with his own eyes. And to say thank you, not out of politeness, but for something deeper he couldn't yet name. He passed the row of metal chairs in the waiting area outside the recovery ward. The cold white lights reflected off the floor. But at the far end of the row, a pocket of unexpected warmth appeared. Two little girls with golden curls and white dresses, sitting side by side, one reading a comic book, the other swinging her legs, eyes lost in thought. Nathan stopped, drew a deep breath, and knew with certainty that nothing from this moment on would ever be the same. Amolido. Nathan took a few more steps, the faint click of his leather shoes carrying across the tiled floor. The two girls looked up almost at the same moment. Their clear eyes held both curiosity and calm, no trace of shyness, before the tall stranger in a suit. He stopped about 2 meters away, leaning slightly forward, his voice low but gentle. "You must be Sophie and Ella, right?" They glanced at each other briefly, Then both nodded. Nathan gave a small, genuine smile, one of the rare ones not rehearsed for the boardroom. I think you saved my life. Sophie's eyes widened as she set her comic book down. You're the man who fell in the park the other day. That's right. Nathan nodded. I was very lucky you were there that morning. Ella slipped off her seat and stepped closer, her voice steady and clear. I called the ambulance. I know the number 911. Nathan tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. I know. Everyone told me you were both very calm and very brave. Again, the two exchanged a glance. There was no pride in their eyes. No expectation of praise, just the quiet acceptance of something that, to them, was simply the natural thing to do. That composure tightened something strange and unfamiliar in Nathan's chest. He asked softly, "Would you mind if I sat here with you for a while?" Two golden heads nodded gently. Nathan eased himself down beside them, masking the faint catch in his breath as the ache in his chest lingered. A brief silence settled until Sophie pointed toward the room across the hall, its window blinds drawn shut. Our mom is in there. She hasn't woken up yet. Nathan followed her gaze, his voice slowing. I'm so sorry. This must be hard for you both. Ella gave a small shrug, though something in her eyes seemed older than her years. We tell her stories every day. Grandma says maybe she can hear us. Nathan bit his lip, a tightness rising in his throat. These two had grown accustomed to the scent of disinfectant, to the steady beeping of heart monitors, and to living on hope, day after day. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a business card and handed it to Ella. This is my number. If you or your grandmother ever need anything, call me. Ella accepted it with both hands. As if it were something precious, she tilted her head and asked, Are you a doctor? Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. No. I build houses, but I can still help. Ella stayed quiet for a moment before slipping the card into her little pink backpack. Nathan rose, leaning down to meet both their eyes. Thank you. Truly. They didn't answer, but those clear blue eyes followed him until he turned away. And as Nathan walked the hallway back to his own room, he found the hospital corridor didn't feel as cold as it had that morning. In his mind, an invisible thread had begun to weave itself between him and the two little girls, something strong, deep, and certain to be hard to let go. In the days following their meeting, time seemed to slow for Nathan. His body healed little by little, but his mind found no rest. Whenever he closed his eyes, he didn't see the boardrooms he'd missed or the contracts waiting for his signature. Instead, he saw two tiny hands clasped tightly together, a pink phone no bigger than a palm, and deep blue eyes holding a sorrow far beyond their years. Nathan asked his assistant to learn more about the girl's family. Just a few days later, he had the answer, and the weight of it settled on his chest like a stone. Sophie and Ella's mother, Rachel Bennett, was a nurse at a local clinic. 6 weeks ago, she had been in a car accident and had fallen into a deep coma. The girl's father had been gone for years. Their only guardian now was their grandmother, a woman in her 70s, caring for both her granddaughters and her hospitalized daughter, while also trying to cover the mounting medical bills. They lived in a small apartment in a modest neighborhood, just a 15-minute walk from the hospital, a route Sophie and Ella knew so well that every paving stone felt like an old friend. That day, when Nathan collapsed in the park, those two children had walked that entire route not for play or adventure, but to be by their mother's side. He sat silently on his hospital bed, reading the brief report over and over. In his mind, he saw himself at 5 years old, the only son of a real estate magnate. His childhood had been private cars, in-home tutors, bright and warm rooms. Never had his parents been in a hospital bed. Never had he needed to find his way anywhere on his own. He had been taught how to win, how to stand firm in a boardroom, but never how to stand still in the face of pain. Sophie and Ella were different. They knew how many steps it took to walk a hospital corridor, knew the way the smell of antiseptic clung to their hair, and knew how to smile, even when the whole world around them was steeped in worry. And when they saw a stranger collapse, they didn't panic or run, they helped, simply because helping was what you did. On the morning Nathan was discharged, the company driver was waiting to take him home. But he said, "Wait a little longer. There's something I need to do." He told no one else. Quietly, he returned to the recovery ward where Rachel lay. The door stood slightly ajar, and he saw Sophie sitting in a chair beside the bed, gently combing her mother's hair with a small plastic brush. Ella sat close, telling a story about a little bird who got lost and then found its way home. When they noticed him, neither asked why he had come back. They simply looked up and gave him a small nod of greeting, as if his presence were the most natural thing in the world. Nathan stepped inside, his voice low. "Mind if I sit with the three of you for a while?" Sophie nodded, and Ella continued her story without pause. Nathan pulled a chair closer to the bed, sitting down and watching the two girls. There were no tears, no complaints, only a quiet resilience, like an invisible suit of armor. In that moment, Nathan realized these girls didn't need rescuing. They were already warriors in their little dresses, but even warriors needed a place to rest. And if he could, he wanted to be the one standing there, holding up the space between their strength and the sheer survival they were carrying on their small shoulders. From that day on, Nathan's presence in Rachel's hospital room was no longer a surprise. He came every day sometimes with a box of crayons and a few coloring books to help the girls pass the time, sometimes bringing nothing but himself and a whole afternoon to give. He would sit between Sophie and Ella, reading stories aloud to all three of them. Even when Rachel couldn't respond, he still spoke to her, as though every word he shared might find its way into some quiet corner of her sleeping mind. At first, the nurses and doctors regarded Nathan with mild curiosity. One or two even asked the grandmother if he was a relative or an old friend. But soon, they stopped asking, merely greeting him with a smile when they saw him arrive holding 2 cups of warm milk, one for Sophie, one for Ella. In less than a week, Nathan knew more about Rachel than he did about some members of his own company's board. Once a nurse at a small clinic, she had been raising her daughters alone since her husband left. She worked night shifts to earn extra income, yet always came home in time to cook dinner for the girls. The grandmother told him little stories, how Rachel loved baking on weekends, how she taught her daughters to memorize the emergency number. To Nathan, these details were like puzzle pieces forming the picture of a woman both resilient and warm. One evening, Nathan returned to his penthouse high above the city, the vast apartment so quiet that his footsteps echoed against the glass walls. He sat at the empty dining table, his mind still replaying Sophie's giggle when she colored outside the lines, or the way Ella tilted her head to catch every word of his stories. He realized he had no desire to return to his old rhythm, at least, not yet. The next morning, Nathan arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. The girls weren't there yet, and the room was quiet. He sat down beside Rachel's bed, looking at her pale but peaceful face. After a brief hesitation, he spoke softly. "You've raised 2 extraordinary daughters. They saved my life, and I think I owe you more than just a thank you. I don't know exactly how yet, but I won't walk away from the 3 of you." When he finished, he stood and pulled out his phone, calling one of the country's leading neurologists. His voice was calm but resolute as he invited the doctor to consult on Rachel's case, pledging to cover every cost, including the most advanced treatment options available. Less than 24 hours later, Rachel was moved to a private, well-equipped room, surrounded by top-selected medical staff. Sophie and Ella might have been too young to grasp the extent of these changes, but their grandmother understood. One afternoon, she stepped into the hallway to find Nathan. Her voice trembled from both exhaustion and emotion. "I don't know why you're doing all of this, but truly, thank you. The girls, they need someone right now." Nathan met her eyes, the lines of age etched deep in them, and replied quietly, "So do I." That night, Nathan returned to the room after walking the girls home. Rachel still lay there, her breathing steady under the warm amber light. At the foot of the bed, Sophie and Ella had left behind 2 colored drawings, one of a star-filled sky, the other of 3 people holding hands. Nathan smiled, picked them up, and folded them carefully into his jacket pocket. He knew now this was no longer about repaying a debt. This was family in a way he had never imagined. But that felt entirely, unquestionably right. Since Rachel had been moved into her private room, Nathan had become almost woven into the daily rhythm of the little family. He showed up in the mornings with 2 cups of warm milk, and in the afternoons with small gifts. Sometimes a book of fairy tales, sometimes a puzzle set, other times just a few packs of the bubblegum Sophie and Ella adored. He didn't do it to impress anyone. It was simply what felt natural to do. He began to notice the signs of fatigue in the girls. Sophie would occasionally rub her eyes and murmur about a slight headache from lack of sleep. By late afternoon, Ella often grew quieter, her voice softer. Their clothes always smelled faintly of clean soap, but the fabric was thin and worn. Their grandmother did her best to keep everything in order, but Nathan could see the exhaustion in her slow, careful steps. So, he acted. It took him only a day to find Linda a gentle, patient aide with experience caring for both the elderly and young children. Linda began visiting the grandmother's home for a few hours each day, helping with errands, cooking, and cleaning. At first, the grandmother refused, worried it was too much trouble, but eventually she accepted, her thin hands trembling each time she carried a heavy grocery bag. Nathan didn't stop there. He hired a tutor to come twice a week, so Sophie and Ella could keep up with their schoolwork. He also arranged a prepaid account at the pharmacy nearest their home, meaning that whenever the grandmother or the girls needed medicine, the store would provide it immediately. No payment required. For Nathan, money had never been an obstacle, but what eased his mind was knowing he could place a safety net beneath 3 people who had grown used to living without one. One late night, after Sophie and Ella had fallen asleep in the chairs pulled close to their mother's bed, Nathan stepped into the hallway and called his therapist a number he'd avoided dialing for almost a year. This time, he didn't talk about work, about the pressure of running a company, or the real estate market. He spoke about 2 little girls who had stirred in him something he thought he'd forgotten, the feeling of wanting to stay for someone. He told her that, for the first time, his sense of responsibility had nothing to do with profit or reputation, and everything to do with making sure those 2 girls would be all right. He admitted that the hours spent in that small, antiseptic-smelling room, hearing Ella's soft giggles, or feeling Sophie lean her head on his shoulder, made all his other achievements feel hollow. That night, Nathan returned home and sat alone at his dining table. In the vast apartment, the ticking of the clock was so loud, it was almost unbearable. The decision he had carried with him since the day he woke up in the recovery ward had finally reached the point of action. The next morning, he met with his lawyer not to discuss a contract, but to ask about the process of securing legal guardianship for Sophie and Ella, should the worst happen to Rachel. He had no intention of taking them away from their grandmother. He simply wanted to ensure that no matter what, they would have someone to protect them. He also immediately set up a trust fund in the girls' names, guaranteeing their medical care, education, and any other essential needs would always be covered. He kept all of this to himself. Sophie and Ella still lived in a world of fairy tales, crayons, and warm blankets. They didn't need to know about legal documents or financial arrangements. What they needed was someone who would show up every day. One afternoon, as the 3 of them sat together, Ella suddenly asked, "If our mom wakes up, will you still be here?" The question made Nathan pause. He looked into those wide, round eyes and caught a flicker of uncertainty. Slowly, he answered, "If you don't want me to go, then I won't go anywhere." Ella said nothing, only nodding before scooting closer and resting her head against his arm. In that moment, Nathan knew his answer no longer came from gratitude for having his life saved. It came from the deepest part of his heart, the part that knew he didn't want to lose these 2 little girls, no matter what happened. That morning, as Nathan stepped into the hospital, he found Sophie and Ella sitting in the hallway. Each clutched a small paper bag against her chest, decorated with hand-drawn stars and flowers in crayon. The moment they saw him, they jumped up and ran over, eyes sparkling. "We have a present for you, Uncle Nathan," Ella announced excitedly. Inside each bag was a slightly squashed but wonderfully fragrant blueberry muffin. Sophie beamed. We asked the lady in the cafeteria to help us make them. Nathan sat down on the bench right there, opened one of the bags, took a bite, then closed his eyes and nodded with exaggerated satisfaction. Best I've ever had. The girls burst into laughter, Sophie covering her mouth as she giggled, Ella leaning her head against his shoulder. A simple moment. But to Nathan, it felt more sacred than any lavish celebration he had ever attended. Since becoming part of this family's life, Nathan had changed. He laughed more, not the polite, camera-ready smile he used to give, but the kind that came unbidden when Ella made a joke, or when Sophie pressed her lips together in fierce concentration, trying to draw a perfect circle. His colleagues noticed the difference, but no one asked. They only saw that the once cold, guarded man now carried something warm in his gaze. But not everyone was pleased. In a closed-door meeting high in the tower, the chairman of the board spoke bluntly. Nathan, this company can't run if its leader is distracted. Either you go back to the way you were fully committed, or you should consider stepping aside. Silence fell over the room. Some avoided his eyes. Others gave the slightest of nods. Nathan sat tall, his hand tightening slightly. In his mind, he saw Sophie and Ella by their mother's bedside, reading aloud in their clear, sweet voices. Finally, he looked up, his voice calm but resolute. I understand, but I'm not changing what I'm doing. That afternoon, Nathan returned to the hospital with a new fairy tale book. He and the girls took turns reading to Rachel. Halfway through, he noticed Rachel's eyelids flutter. Holding his breath, he watched. Then it happened again. A faint tremor. Nurse, Nathan called out sharply. Within minutes, Rachel's eyes opened. Weak, unfocused but alive, she blinked, taking in the light, the sounds, and perhaps the voices she had known all along. The next day, when Sophie and Ella walked into the room, their mother was already looking toward the door. The girls froze for a heartbeat, then both ran forward. Sophie threw her arms around her mother, tears streaming freely. Ella laughed and cried at once, her voice breaking. Mom, you came back to us. Rachel's trembling hand smoothed her daughter's hair. The sight made Nathan stand still, a sharp ache blooming in his chest. But it was an ache born of warmth, not pain. The doctors called it a remarkable step forward. Rachel would need a long road of therapy to speak again, to walk again, but the most important thing was that she was here. And Nathan knew this miracle had been fueled by the steadfast love of her two daughters, a love that had reached him too, from the very first day they stepped into his life. From the moment Rachel opened her eyes, Nathan's schedule shifted completely. He no longer came to the hospital just to talk with Sophie and Ella. He became part of Rachel's recovery. He met regularly with the therapists, hired a private nurse for extra care, and began renovating a small house by the edge of the park, a place he envisioned as a new home for the whole family. Rachel's recovery was slow but steady. At first, she could only keep her eyes open for a few minutes, then gradually began moving her fingers, lifting her arm, and sitting up with assistance. Each small milestone was a victory, and the three of them, Nathan, Sophie, and Ella, celebrated in their own way, with a smile, a new story, or a hug that lingered just a little longer. One afternoon, Nathan sat on a bench in the hospital garden with the two girls. The sunset light turned Sophie and Ella's curls to gold. Sophie, licking her ice cream, suddenly looked up. Now that our mom's getting better, are you going to leave? The question caught Nathan off guard. He met her round gaze and smiled. No, I'm not going anywhere. Ella, licking the last of the melting ice cream from her hand, tilted her head. Even if our mom doesn't remember who you are, she'll remember. But even if she didn't, I'd still stay, Nathan said, his voice certain. A few days later, Rachel was strong enough to go outside in a wheelchair. Nathan pushed her slowly along the brick path, while Sophie and Ella ran ahead, their laughter ringing like silver bells. Rachel turned her head toward him, her voice weak but clear. You've done more for us than we could ever repay. Nathan shook his head. You and the girls gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. and nothing can buy that. None of us owes the other anything. Rachel smiled, gratitude shining in her eyes. The girls love you very much. And I love them, he replied, his gaze following the two blonde heads bent over dandelions by the path. Weeks later, when Rachel was ready to leave the hospital, Nathan brought them all to the newly renovated house. Sunlight filled the rooms. A small garden bloomed out front, and a cozy room just for Sophie and Ella overflowed with books, crayon, and a little desk. A new life began. In the mornings, Nathan fumbled through braiding the girls' hair before taking them to school. In the afternoons, he patiently helped Ella build birdhouses in the garden or watched Sophie set up elaborate puppet shows. Rachel, though still in physical therapy, often sat on the porch, quietly watching with a smile that never left her face. One weekend, Nathan suggested they all go back to the park, where everything began. Rachel held his arm, taking slow but steady steps, while Sophie and Ella dashed ahead toward the fountain. When they reached the patch of grass where Nathan had collapsed months ago, Ella turned and called out, "Uncle Nathan, this is where everything changed." "Right," Nathan smiled. "That's right. Right here." Sophie planted her hands on her hips, mischief in her eyes. "Back then, you looked like a sleeping giant." Laughter rippled through the group. Rachel took in the moment, breathing in the cool air, and murmured, "And somehow, these two little girls woke that giant." Nathan turned to her, his eyes soft. "They didn't just wake me. They saved me." That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Nathan stood in the doorway, watching them sleep. Golden hair spilled over the pillows, their breathing deep and even. He thought back to that morning in the park, when he thought he was about to lose everything, only to gain more than he'd ever had. He knew the years ahead would still hold challenges. Rachel had a long road of recovery, and Sophie and Ella would grow up and ask harder questions. But one thing was certain. They would face it all together, not out of obligation, but because they had chosen to be a family. Once, a man had fallen, and two little girls refused to walk past. Now, he no longer needed skyscrapers to feel tall. He had found something stronger than any success, a family. Tutu, friends. Nathan, Sophie, and Ella's story must have touched your heart, hasn't it? A journey from darkness to light, where love and courage created a miracle. If you felt your heart swell reading this, click like now to help share this beautiful message. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next heartwarming story. With just one click, you can help love travel farther. Share this video with your family and friends, and leave a comment telling us about a moment that changed you. Thank you for joining me in feeling this miracle. Act now, like, share, subscribe, and see you next time with even more inspiration. Bye.